Millennials and Gen Z in the workplace are demanding that sense that their organizations are ethical in the way in which they both interact with the world and the communities around them, but also how they treat their employees. And there is an innate sense of fairness that employees really are insisting upon. And so the people functions within the business are recognizing if we want to attract the very best people and keep them, this is something that we absolutely need to address.
Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today I am joined by Scott Walker. Scott is the CEO for XpertHR, part of the Lexis Nexis Risk Solutions Group. Scott has had a huge amount of industry and global experience working for brands across the board when it comes to market, insight, data, analytics, and various other technology firms. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you, Leila. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. I finally managed to track you down. and so I've got to ask straight off the bat, tell us a little bit about how you came to be where you are today, not only in the role as CEO for XpertHR, but also about the personal journey, because you've had quite some journey making it to this point.
Yeah, thank you, Leila. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think when you meet leaders, senior leaders, you never really know their story. And in reality, I found that despite the stereotype that there's a cookie cutter mold for what makes great leaders, I found that actually not to be true. And people come from a really interesting mix of backgrounds and experiences. I'm probably no different in that sense. So I suppose it would be classified as being an unconventional route into the world of business leadership. But my family, my mum is one of 21 children from a big East End family, so the East End of London. So grew up in poverty, and my parents fought really hard and worked really hard to kind of get out of that situation. So I grew up with two great role models in mum and dad. And that was an interesting, that shaped my experience, right? Because I grew up watching two individuals fight to get out of where they were and to build a good life for themselves and for their families. So I grew up with the great examples of what hard work and perseverance and resilience can do for you. I think the interesting thing for me is when I was about 14, my parents' businesses collapsed. They lost everything. And I tell this story of sitting in a Pizza Hut restaurant in 1984 with my mum as she was trying to explain to me how life was about to change, and I remember not my proudest moment, right? But I remember feeling wrong done by and put into a situation that I didn't want to be in, and in that moment was probably a really pivotal moment for my early career, because I kind of swore at that point I was never going to rely upon anyone for anything. So out of the fear that created and the insecurity that created, it drove me initially into the world of work, and I left school at 16. A few qualifications behind me, but not really, and went straight into a world where I felt like, okay, I need to start earning some money. Mum and dad were still struggling, so they needed help, and so my first ever job was a commission only sales job, and I ended up contributing to the household income, and I remember sort of helping mum and dad pay their mortgage, and that was interesting to watch that. And I think now I'm much older, when I reflect back, I can kind of see how that was a bit of a driving force in my initial career, the energy that I got, my career choice, because I came out of school with no qualifications. Where can I earn some money? What skills do I have? I had a decent personality. Maybe I could go and sell some stuff. And so, but when I reflect back, I realized that actually what that created for me was quite an intense sense of insecurity and fear. And the early part of my career was certainly driven, I think, a lot by this sense of I don't want that to happen to me. That's interesting. And it took me quite a while before I got to a place where I was much happier with who I was, much more confident in my capabilities and what I can do, and actually clearer-eyed on what I wanted. So as a result of that, I worked in a number of different organizations in this industry, worked for some very, very large corporates, different experiences. I'm sure we'll get into some of that as we go through. But essentially, my career went in sales and marketing, ended up becoming sort of senior leader within the sales world. And then had a very pivotal moment around 2008 where I decided to take a massive career shift. And I'm sure we will come to talk about that. But yeah, essentially over the last 15 years, I've been leading businesses in the sort of information and data analytics space, and spent the last 11 years at RELX, a parent company for XpertHR and Lexis Nexis Risk Solutions, and been loving it.
Wow, what a journey, Scott. And thank you so much for sharing as well about your parents. It must have been incredibly humbling, and also, you know, I'm sure that you were almost forced to grow up quite quickly, because what a young age to be taking the, well, the positive burden, I'll call it, on your shoulders of paying the mortgage and feeling that sense of responsibility. And goodness, a commission-only sales role. I mean, that's wonderfully hardcore. I think there's nothing that teaches you resilience and tenacity like a commission-only sales role.
But do you know what, Leila? So I joke. So I tell that story to people that I meet, and so that they get a little bit of a sense of who I am. But I tell the story that in that job, I used to literally walk through I was selling cash registers of all things. And I would walk through the doors of pubs, restaurants, shops. And immediately what I was doing was trying to establish a rapport with the owner. And you do that by making a connection, asking questions, trying to understand where they are in their business needs as it relates to the thing I'm trying to sell. And you look to influence them by asking questions. And I joke, every time I walk into a meeting today, I'm still selling cash registers, because all the skills I learned in that meeting are still using them today, right? You're listening, you're building rapport, you're seeking to understand, you're asking questions, you're looking to influence. So I joke that really I'm still just selling cash registers.
Transferable skills, completely
right.
transferable skills.
Who knew?
It's life lessons like that, though, that you learn and you kind of never forget, really.
They stay with you. They stay with you.
Indeed. So fast forward to where you are today. You've got two fantastic daughters as well. You do other interests on the side in addition to the CEO role. Talk to us a little bit about the present role and some of the ways in which the present role actually does spearhead some of the industry challenges, so to speak.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do, but I think it's really interesting to talk actually about what we're observing. So XpertHR is it's a fairly well-known brand in the UK. We've been around about 20 years. We've predominantly historically been known for best practice guidance for HR professionals, everything from tools and templates and here's how you should deploy this, and really helping HR make workplaces really purposeful and engaged for everybody. But we in about 3 or 4 years ago, we switched a new focus line for us, which was really around pay equality. And we launched we have a number of different products in this area, but in response to the UK regulation around gender pay gap reporting, we brought our first product to market in this area. We now have a whole suite of products under the Gap Square brand. And what's interesting about that is, and I've said this to you before, I know you've heard me say this before, I'm a pay equity optimist. And what I mean by that is, yes, the pay gaps definitely, absolutely still exist, and they are not closing fast enough. But actually, we've had a wealth of experience of working with companies. So today, we're working just under 1,000 companies in essentially helping them understand their pay gap, and we've been doing that now, again, I said, for about 4 or 5 years. What we're seeing is two things going on there, two dynamics, and one follows the other. So the first dynamic we're seeing is the proliferation of both pay gap and pay transparency regulation. Where, most recently, you can see the state of California has issued the sort of pay transparency regulation following on from New York. We're seeing that both pay gap reporting and pay transparency regulation on the agenda for the EU, the regulatory agenda for the EU. We're seeing it proliferate around the world. Very much like we saw in the UK, right? So in the UK, we had gender pay gap regulation coming in sort of 4 or 5 years ago. Now, since then, as I said, we've been working with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies in the UK. And it's interesting. I see the pay gap market in two ways. So one, we call them progressive corporates, right? We have organizations that are large in scale that absolutely see the value of creating equitable workplaces and the importance of that in both attracting and retaining the very best talent and how that makes commercial sense for the business. Also, the fact that the rise of ethical investing means that it gives them the opportunity to attract ethical investment funds, right? So there's a great dynamic going on. I say that for once, doing the right thing is also the right thing commercially for businesses, and it's a bit of a sweet spot moment in history, I think, for organizations to go, actually doing the right thing is also the right thing for the bottom line. So we've got that dynamic going on, right? You've got the thought leaders, the large corporates that are looking to adopt it. But the other thing that we're seeing, which is, I think, equally as exciting, is in markets where pay gap regulation has been put in place, pay gap reporting regulation has been put in place, like the UK. Obviously, there's a clamour for organisations, depending on the size of the regulation. In the UK, it's more than 250 people, right? So, okay, we've got to do this. We don't know how to do it. We just need to submit our report. And it's the first step in organizations understanding what that pay gap is. But what's happening is those organizations that have been reporting for 4 or 5 years, they're now coming and they're saying, actually, this isn't changing. Like, we want to know how we change that, and we want to do something about it. And they're coming to us now and they're looking to upgrade the tools and products that they buy for us. They're going to our Xpert Pro product, which does that kind of insight and analysis and helps them understand, how do I scenario plan to really change it? And it's coming not from a place of regulatory pressure, it's coming from within the organizations. And what's happening, I think, is where pay gap reporting regulation gets put in place, that raises the awareness, and instinctively organizations get to a point like, we want to do something about this, we don't know how. And so increasingly we're seeing relatively medium-sized businesses that wouldn't fit that category that I described as progressive corporates wanting to adopt the technology to make a difference. So I'm a huge optimist. I'm a huge optimist around closing the pay gap. It's not the sort of thing that closes quickly. I think everyone understands the dynamics of that. But I think with the proliferation of regulation and with the knock-on effect of what happens when people and organizations just become every year reminded of the scale of their gap, their innate desire to want to do something about it. And so, yeah, I'm a firm believer that we're on the right path, and we'll get there.
Do you know, Scott, it is so insightful hearing you talk about these different elements of pay equity, and organizations. We're seeing this a lot as well. The rise of ethical investing and ESG in specific, where organizations, stakeholder groups is widening hugely to involve everyone from the customers, even investor relations, through to the employee voice, which is growing hugely. And so when you talk about thought leadership and adoption of these different areas of business for good, almost, there's a huge need now for organizations not just to be paying lip service to this, but to truly be walking the walk, for which they are speaking about. And our future generations of leaders expect this as well.
Yeah, and genuinely, we observe organizations now that, and it's been driven a little bit by, it's been driven on two fronts, right? So we talk about ethical investing, the rise of ESG, and that's definitely had an impact, because we suddenly see in the organizations that we work with, investor relations really engaged in addressing this problem. Now, a cynic could say that they don't really care about solving the problem. They care about attracting, right, the investment that's coming in. It's a cynical view. But then what we have is kind of C-suite HR professionals that genuinely are looking to recognize that solving this problem, addressing the problem, creates such strength for the employer brand. And they know that, and this is the other place where it's been driven from, millennials and Gen Z in the workplace are demanding that sense that their organizations are ethical in the way in which they both interact with the world and the communities around them, but also how they treat their employees. And there is an innate sense of fairness that employees really are insisting upon. And so the people functions within the business are recognizing, if we want to attract the very best people and keep them, this is something that we absolutely need to address. So you've got kind of two sides to the coin, right? You've got those that are trying to attract investment and those that are trying to attract the very best talent with the same agenda. And so again, it makes me optimistic because I genuinely believe that with the proliferation of the regulations, it spreads around the world, and with the dynamic that's going on, ethical investing is only on the rise as well. I'm genuinely believe that we're going to be in a position, where we'll start to see the tide turn in a really meaningful way.
So the future is looking bright, Scott, which is super. I love your optimism. Where is the future for XpertHR and the portfolio of organizations? Because you've got a whole number of fantastic brands in there, all ethical organizations, all trying to do a good thing for business and ultimately wider society.
Yeah, I don't want to turn this into a pitch for XpertHR, so I'll be careful not to do that, but we're very passionate about what we do. Look, essentially, our mantra is creating purposeful workplaces for all, right? And there's two really important components to that. Ultimately, organizations spend billions of pounds and dollars on their workforces, right? It's not, or quite often, very often, the most expensive line item on the P&L, right? But how do we unlock the potential in that investment? And increasingly today, there is a recognition of actually you need to create, you need to be an amazing employer, and there's lots of dimensions to that, but you need to create an amazing employee experience in order to be able to attract the very best, but then keep them engaged. And that phrase purposeful really captures that, right? It's a, how do I create a operating environment to attract the very best talent for them to be able to thrive, to feel connected to the vision and mission of the business. So we have 20 years experience of doing that, right? We best practice guidance. That's absolutely what we do. But increasingly what we're finding is organizations are trying to think about how do they tackle the issues and opportunities around D&I, and that's where the all bit comes in. So increasingly, our focus has very much been around how do we deploy the expertise that we have, and we have a lot of it, 20 years experience of serving thousands and thousands of organizations. We estimate that about just short of a third of the entire UK workforce, so all of those employed in the UK, work for organizations that use our products. So the exciting thing about that, Leila, is we really have some scope here to make an impact. And we have amazing relationships with 40,000 HR managers that are part of our community. So we have a really good platform actually to really drive some of this change. And so, the advent of our Xpert product suite has really been at the forefront of our efforts around pay equity. But increasingly what we're seeing is opportunities for bringing together different components. So I'll talk a little bit about pay transparency regulation, and I'll give you a really sort of short example of where that's important. So if you take the New York or California regulation, where organizations have to declare every time they advertise a job exactly what they are paying for that role, that in itself doesn't seem like a difficult thing to do. Obviously, employees of those organizations are going to stop and look and say, that's interesting. That job is coming in at that price point. That doesn't kind of match with my expectations of my value for the business and what I'm being paid. So it immediately creates a challenge back into the organization for the organization to pay fairly. Two components to that. One, you can't pay fairly unless you have a really well-established job hierarchy, pay hierarchy, and you'll be surprised how many organizations don't have that. So that is a very technical component in being able to deliver pay equity and pay fairness. And so, for example, our latest product release is around pay grading, which is really enabling organizations to do that piece of work in a really sophisticated way, simplifying the process. Historically, it's been done by expensive consulting projects that have to be redone every 3 years. And so we're looking to build products that address the systemic challenges of creating fairness in the workplace. Some of those things are really big, grand and grandiose problems like pay equity broadly. Others are really technical. It's actually, I need to do this well. And there's plenty of organizations that don't do that. So our focus is absolutely around how do we continue to create best advice and best practice guidance and tools for HR to be able to do an amazing job, but also how do we tackle some of these challenges around equity and equality within the workplace so that's equal for all. That sound like an infomercial?
No, it didn't sound like an infomercial. I mean, it's fascinating, especially the dynamic between where we are at in the UK versus where we're at in the States. And we found the exact same thing. Actually, when we're looking specifically at CEO -2 across the board with a whole number of organizations, there are real marked differences between the UK and between the US. But the fact that there is now this regulation in NYC and California to really declare what salaries are, it starts to change the entire market dynamic, this transparency. So
it does. And Leila, can I make a point on that, which I think is really interesting? So touching upon, let me tell you why I'm so optimistic around the proliferation of regulation. I say I've been in this industry for nearly 30 years, right? And so I've been worked in different data and analytics businesses serving different markets. A part of my history was at the beginning of the rise of know your customer regulation and anti-money laundering regulation. So the first business I ran in that regard was almost 15 years ago. And so completely different topic, completely unrelated to what we're talking about today. But interestingly, there are some parallels. So what we saw with the focus around anti-money laundering regulation and the proliferation of it, it was very much being driven by a social agenda. And that social agenda was stamping out corruption and terrorist financing. And there was a lot of profile of coverage of those types of cases from the media. So there was absolutely a groundswell of coverage from the media of a agenda developing and narrative developing within society around these things need to get tackled. What you saw was developed westernized democracies adopting that regulation first, very similar to what we're seeing in the world of pay equity, right? And then what you saw is this proliferation that went around the world because it became the standard, it became the norm, it became what was expected of financial institutions. And I think we're going to see the same thing happening with pay equity regulation. I think we've seen it in the UK, we're seeing it developing in the US, but EU will issue regulation next year in action. We're seeing it pick up, and we're starting to see it in some parts of Asia as well. And so that makes me optimistic. I can't believe that's going to go. I've seen a pattern in a completely unrelated market that had some similar dynamics driving it. And I think we'll see the same thing happen in the world of pay equity as well.
Let's hope so. So watch this space then.
Yeah, well, and that's important because, as you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Scarlett and Olivia earlier, my two daughters, and as you know, I talk a lot about wanting to leave the world a fairer place, and so for them, and they're my yardstick of fairness. They keep me honest and informed, actually, and so that's important, right? You need your personal drivers. You need to work out what's important to you, and certainly that's a big component of it for me.
And talking of personal drivers, before we run out of time, I would love to go into a brief lightning round, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds on the clock to answer each of the next questions. I'm going to start with the hardest one first, and that is, what would you say is your secret to success?
I would say, what's the secret to my success? So I always say everyone has a superpower. You just need to understand what your superpower is. And I see it in the people that I lead and that I recruit. And I think for me, I've been very blessed in the ability to be able to identify and motivate really, really key talent. It's a bit of a cliche. We talk about hiring people that are smarter than you, but if you were to sit in my senior leadership team, you will know that to be true. But that's I don't have an ego around that, and I kind of look to bring and work with really, really smart people. So that's been the secret to my success, is the ability to actually attract those people to come and work. And I also think part of that is about the environment you create for them. because smart people want to work in a place where they feel good about what they're doing, but they're also empowered and enabled to do their thing. So that's unquestionably, that's been the thing that's been the biggest driver for me, I think.
This is so true. I really like what you said there about there being no ego, because if we're jogging to keep up with people that are around us, we're in the right place.
We are. I've learned more. I've learned more from people that work for me than people I've worked for in my career, and I actually think that that's probably true for most people, but we may not recognize it. And so I actively look for those learning moments from the teams that I'm on and the people that I hire, because honestly, throughout my career, that's been a consistent experience for me. And I think that's probably a mindset more than anything else.
How about your favorite heroes or sheroes?
So I'm going to be controversial. I don't like that. I don't like the idea of individuals having heroes or sheroes. And and let me tell you why. So I absolutely believe we can be inspired and we can learn from many, many different people, right? People either have ideas, they have experiences, they demonstrate behaviors, all of which we can learn from. But I also believe there is, it's again a cliche, but there's a hero in all of us. Like that, every one of us is capable of something significant and substantial and awe-inspiring. We're also equally capable of doing stupid things because we're human. And so the idea that we put people up on a pedestal is completely alien to me. I don't like it. I don't think it should be done, because we are human beings, we are flawed. And I think it's really important to accept and own that, because I think if you can accept and own, even if you are the most inspirational and capable person, you're also capable of being a bit dumb sometimes. And that's really important, to be humble enough to recognize those learning moments. So thank you for asking it, because I'm an ardent anti-hero or shero, because I actually think there's that in all of us. And if I look around the people that have inspired me most, they're really ordinary people like us. And they're capable of great things. And it's in those moments that I get inspired by people. There is no one person I put up on a pedestal.
We often say at Dial, it's all about real models as opposed to role models.
I like that.
These pedestals of fantastic people. I don't know, there's celebrities and people that we might, have some kind of, respect for whatever they may have done. However, those day-to-day, everyday heroes, rather, that you're alluding to there, often ones that influence behaviour very most.
But we always, I think everyone remembers that first boss that really enabled them. I remember mine. It was my first boss I had in this industry. And this individual went out of their way to enable me to make the leap that was necessary to be able to be successful. And the level of personal commitment that individual showed, well, it stays with me today. 30 years later, I will still tell that story. And I can only hope that I have had the opportunity to do that for one or two people myself. Because the other thing I love a saying, because I think it can capture a moment really quite eloquently. And I firmly believe that your legacy, no one remembers the zeros. No one remembers the pounds or the dollars. They only remember the impact that you had on the people that you work with. So your legacy is always the impact you had on someone. It's never the zeros. No matter how many zeros you've been able to put onto balance sheets or P&Ls or revenue lines, no one remembers that. What they remember is the impact you have on them. And that's about providing that inspiration, that support in the moment. And we're all capable of doing that.
And talking of inspiration, if you could go back in time and let's take you right back to the age of 14, when you're back with mum and dad and life is hard, what advice would you give to the young Scott?
Oh, this is really tough, because I think the lesson that took me the longest to learn was the one about having confidence in myself. And there was definitely a massive part of a bit of imposter syndrome happening with me in my early career. And so that was a pivotal moment. I think that started to happen to me in my 30s, where I started to get a bit more confident in my early 30s. But I also recognized that insecurity drove me. And so, I would say, be realistic about what you can do, because you can do it. Don't just beat yourself up or hide. But it's also about harnessing the energy in that moment. And that's another thing I would say. it is really common in senior leaders for that imposter syndrome to have been in place at some point. And I see it in very driven, very capable young executives coming through. I've coached and mentored and developed many that are experiencing that. I think it's far more prevalent than anyone gives it credit for. And I think there is positive in it. And that's what I would always say to people. Don't be scared of the fact that you're driven through a sense of fear or insecurity. Harness it, but control it. Have a sense, have it contextualized in the broader pastel of what you're really capable of. And so I think that's the thing I would like to teach myself if I was 14 years old, is have a bit of faith, have a bit of belief.
That is such a good lesson. And I do you know, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say don't be scared of being driven by that sense of insecurity. And I'm sure that many people who are listening into this podcast who are equally driven, I put myself into that very same category, that really, really resonates. And you kind of wonder to yourself, will that ever go away? Or do you want it to go away? It's a really quite controversial situation.
It's harnessing the power of that fear, because that fear and that insecurity can be a significant driver and motivator of energy and activity and commitment. And one of the things we know is it's not easy, right? And I was going to London with taking my eldest daughter Scarlett to London for a restaurant. It was a treat. She had an amazing school report the other week, and we got into a conversation on the train around the importance of resilience. And actually, bearing in mind the kind of my experience when I was 14, which was kind of tough, and it toughened me up. And you mentioned earlier, I had to take responsibility at a really young age. And we're having a conversation about, well, how do we create an environment where we are today able to develop resilience in our young people? Because you need to be resilient. It is hard, but it's okay to be a bit scared, but it's also okay to have that contextualizing really what your capability set is, and so harness the energy that gives you. And I think it talks a lot about, it is not easy, and taking the responsibility to do that it can be driven very much by that sense of insecurity that comes from imposter syndrome. So I don't always see it as a bad thing. I just think we've got to keep it in its place.
Indeed. Scott, I don't know where to start now when it comes to summarising this conversation, because there have been so many rich learnings. I've really appreciated having you as a guest on the show, and I hope that everyone who's been listening in has learned as much as I have. Some of the key points, including the optimism, which I think is so important in a world of diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, when things are constantly changing. As leaders, we're battling a whole plethora of different issues. Having that unwavering optimism is the overriding piece that has really come out of today's conversation, as well as some of those really key and critical data points and observations of the market, which I'm sure many CHROs, CEOs, and others who are listening in today can take back to their organizations, because we have got to continue being progressive organizations or progressive corporates, as you said, continue to look at what is happening within the market when it comes to regulation, always be striving for that best practice. We're in such a world of change and shifting cultures, dynamics, workforces, and so ensuring that we're always looking for the leading practice or the pay, the pay transparency. All of these different areas of leading practice is absolutely critical.
Yeah,
and finally,
I honestly, I'm so pleased you said that, because that's the one thing that I want to take. I genuinely believe that we cannot be complacent. There is a problem that needs to be tackled, but the solving of the problem creates such opportunities for businesses, and they are driven to want to do it, and it will happen.
I know you love expressions, and one of my favorite ones is that every cloud has a silver lining, and it does. For everything that we may think, oh my goodness, well, that's going to be a challenge, how are we going to get over it? Actually look for the silver lining in those clouds. And I think you've really demonstrated a story of great tenacity and great resilience. And Scott, it has just been brilliant getting to know you a lot better. And I'm sure everyone who's been listening has thoroughly enjoyed this episode as well. Now, if you'd like any further information, you'd like the transcript from today's show, please visit us at www.dialglobal.org/podcast, or you can download the podcast on your favorite podcast app, be it Apple, Spotify, or even YouTube. if you prefer. Scott, thank you ever so much indeed. You've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast show. My name is Leila McKenzie-Delis, and I'll look forward to seeing you again very soon.